Part 1. The Philosophical Imperative of Withdrawal. Philosophy has long treated solitude not as a lack of company, but as a presence of self. For the lone thinker, society often represents a distortion field, a place where doxa, popular opinion, clouds episteme, true knowledge. 1. The cave and the light. The trajectory of the lone thinker begins, conceptually, with Plato. In his allegory of the cave, the journey toward enlightenment is a solitary one. The prisoner who breaks free does so alone. He climbs the jagged path upward, leaving his peers fixated on the shadows on the wall. This establishes the foundational philosophical premise of the lone thinker. Truth is rarely found in the consensus. For the philosopher, the crowd is a source of contamination. The noise of the market, the demands of politics, and the seduction of social approval prevent the deep, sustained concentration required to strip away illusions. To think clearly, one must sever the tether to the collective consciousness. 2. The Stoic Citadel. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, refined the concept of the inner citadel. For them, the lone thinker is not necessarily a hermit in the woods, but a man capable of retreating into himself regardless of his surroundings. However, they acknowledge that physical solitude facilitates this mental retreat. Seneca, in his letters, warned against the infectious nature of the crowd. He argued that every time he returned from a gathering, he returned less of a man, having been swayed by the vices and shifting moods of the mob. For the Stoic lone thinker, solitude is a defensive fortification. It is the space where one hardens the mind against fortune and aligns one's internal compass without magnetic interference from others. 3. The Romantic and the Transcendentalist. Moving into the modern era, the philosophy of the lone thinker shifted from defensive, avoiding vice, to generative, finding genius. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in Reveries of the Solitary Walker, argued that society corrupts the innate goodness of man. To return to nature, and by extension to solitude, was to return to one's authentic self. This reached its zenith with Henry David Thoreau and the American Transcendentalists. Thoreau's experiment at Walden Pond was the quintessential manifesto of the lone thinker. His objective was not misanthropy, but a desire to front only the essential facts of life. Thoreau posits that the lone thinker is the only one who is truly awake. Society lives in a somnambulistic state of routine and conformity. The solitary man, by slowing down and observing the silence, accesses a higher frequency of reality. 4. Nietzsche and the pathos of distance. Perhaps no philosopher romanticized and weaponized solitude quite like Friedrich Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the lone thinker is the free spirit. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the protagonist leaves his home for the mountains, enjoying his spirit and his solitude for 10 years. Nietzsche introduces the concept of the pathos of distance. He argues that great things are never created in the warmth of the herd. The Übermensch, Overman, must possess the strength to stand apart, to endure the chilling winds of the summit. For Nietzsche, solitude is a test of strength. If you cannot bear to be alone, it is because you despise yourself. You use the crowd to distract you from your own emptiness. The lone thinker, conversely, is one whose company is so rich that the presence of others becomes an intrusion. 5. The existential void. In the 20th century, existentialism took a darker view. Sartre and Camus explored the lone thinker not as a hero, but as a consciousness confronting the absurd. When the lone thinker removes social roles, titles, and relationships, they are left with the terrifying freedom of existence. Sartre famously noted, "Hell is other people," implying that the gaze of the other objectifies us. To be alone is to escape that objectification and reclaim subjectivity. However, Arendt offered a counterpoint, defining thinking as the soundless dialogue between me and myself. She argued that the lone thinker is never truly one, but two, the self and the witnessing self. Solitude is the venue for this internal conversation. Part 2. The Psychology of Solitude. While philosophy explains the purpose of the lone thinker, psychology unveils the mechanics. What happens to the human brain when it is deprived of social input? How does the solitary mind process information differently? Solitude versus loneliness versus isolation. Psychologically, it is vital to distinguish between three states that are often conflated. Isolation, an objective state of having few social contacts. Loneliness, a subjective, distressing feeling of emotional lack or abandonment. Solitude, a voluntary, constructive state of being alone. The lone thinker resides in solitude, not loneliness. Research suggests that the ability to tolerate and enjoy solitude is a distinct personality trait, often correlated with high autonomy and emotional regulation. The capacity to be alone, as defined by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, is a marker of emotional maturity. It signals that the individual has internalized a secure base and does not require constant external validation to feel real. 2. The default mode network and creativity neuroscience provides a compelling justification for the lone thinker's lifestyle. The brain operates using several networks, two of the most prominent being the executive control network, used for task-focused external attention, and the default mode network, DMN. The DMN activates when we stop focusing on the outside world, when we daydream, reflect, or let our minds wander. This is the seat of imagination, memory consolidation, and self-referential thought. In a hypersocial, hyper-connected world, the brain is constantly reacting to external stimuli, keeping the DMN suppressed. The lone thinker, by withdrawing from social noise, allows the DMN to flourish. This explains the incubation effect in psychology, where a difficult problem is solved not by grinding away at it, but by stepping away and walking alone in silence. The solitary mind can access lateral connections and intuitive leaps that the socially engaged mind cannot. Flow states and deliberate practice. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, a state of complete immersion in an activity, is intimately tied to the lone thinker. While flow can occur in groups, e.g., a jazz band, intellectual flow is almost exclusively solitary. Writing, coding, painting, or solving complex equations requires a depth of cognitive resources that are easily disrupted by a simple interruption. Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice further cements the necessity of the lone thinker. Mastery requires thousands of hours of practice where the individual pushes their limits and receives immediate feedback. This intensity is rarely sustainable in a group setting. The virtuoso violinist, the chess grandmaster, and the theoretical physicist all share a history of aggressive, solitary practice. The introversion spectrum and sensitivity. Carl Jung popularized the terms introvert and extrovert, describing the flow of psychic energy. The lone thinker is archetypally introverted, meaning their energy is recharged by the internal world of ideas, rather than the external world of people. Modern psychology links this to the highly sensitive person, HSP trait or sensory processing sensitivity. The lone thinker often possesses a nervous system that is more reactive to stimuli. Socializing is not just boring, it is biologically expensive. Solitude acts as a sensory shield, lowering the arousal levels of the nervous system to a baseline where deep cognitive processing can occur. 5. The shadow side, the risks of the echo chamber. Psychology also warns of the dangers inherent in the lone thinker's path. The mind is a self-correcting machine, but it often relies on social feedback to calibrate reality. When a thinker is isolated for too long, they risk cognitive drift. Without the friction of opposing viewpoints, the lone thinker can fall prey to confirmation bias and apophenia, perceiving patterns where none exist. We see this in the tragic trajectory of figures like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, or Friedrich Nietzsche's eventual descent into madness. The line between the visionary and the crank is often drawn by the presence of a tether to reality. The healthy lone thinker knows when to emerge from the cave. The unhealthy one gets lost in the dark. Part 3. The phenomenology of the solitary mind. What does it feel like to be the lone thinker? Beyond the neurology and the history, there is a distinct texture to the solitary experience. 1. Time dilation. In the company of others, time is social. It is measured in appointments, conversations, and shared events. For the lone thinker, time becomes fluid. Without the rhythm of social interaction to segment the day, the thinker enters chronos, sequential time, less, and kairos, the opportune moment, more. This allows for deep work, as coined by Cal Newport. The lone thinker can follow a train of thought for 6 hours without the artificial segmentation of the 9-to-5 structure. This temporal freedom is the soil in which monumental works, novels, theorems, philosophies, grow. 2. The intensification of the self. When the voices of others fade, the voice of the self becomes deafening. This is the hurdle that filters out those who are not true lone thinkers. For many, the internal monologue is filled with anxiety, shame, and trivia. However, for the disciplined thinker, this intensification leads to individuation, a Jungian concept. The persona, the mask worn for society, dissolves. The thinker is forced to confront their shadow, the repressed, darker parts of the psyche. This confrontation is painful but essential for integration. The lone thinker emerges from this process not just smarter, but more whole. 3. The relationship with the object. The lone thinker develops a peculiar relationship with inanimate objects and abstract concepts. The writer's relationship with the page, the painter's with the canvas, or the mathematician's with the variable becomes an I-thou relationship. borrowing from Martin Buber, usually reserved for people. Because the social drive is redirected, the work itself becomes the companion. The lone thinker is rarely truly alone because they are in communion with the problem they are solving. The intensity of focus creates a bond with the subject matter that is often more intimate than human relationships. Part 4. The lone thinker in the modern world. The 21st century presents a hostile environment for the lone thinker. We live in an attention economy designed to monetize distraction. The philosophical and psychological implications of this shift are profound. 1. The death of boredom. Historically, boredom was the gateway to deep thought. It was the uncomfortable anteroom one had to sit in before the imagination kicked in. Today, technology has eradicated boredom. The moment a lull occurs, a screen is lit. This endangers the existence of the lone thinker. If the brain is never allowed to idle, the default mode network never fully engages. We are raising a generation that may be psychologically incapable of solitude, resulting in a culture of skimmers rather than divers. 2. The illusion of connection versus the reality of isolation. Paradoxically, while true solitude is becoming rarer, neurotic loneliness is increasing. Social media creates a simulacrum of connection. The lone thinker of the past withdrew to find truth. The modern isolated individual often withdraws into a digital echo chamber of algorithmically generated rage or validation. The modern lone thinker must therefore be a digital ascetic. They must actively choose to disconnect. The act of thinking now requires a rebellious act of unplugging. 3. The necessity of the outsider. Despite the cultural drift toward hyperconnection, the lone thinker is more necessary now than ever. Systems, whether political, technological, or economic, tend toward convergence and groupthink. They optimize for efficiency, not truth. The lone thinker acts as the sysadmin of the human condition. By standing outside the system, they can see the bugs that those inside the matrix ignore. Innovation, ethical course correction, and paradigm shifts almost always come from the margin, not the center. The lone thinker is the mutation in the cultural DNA that allows for evolution. Part 5. Synthesis. The dialectic of return. The ultimate lesson from both philosophy and psychology is that the lone thinker's journey is circular, not linear. The hero's journey requires the hero to leave the village, face the trial alone, but crucially, return with the elixir. 1. The Bodhisattva Path. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is one who attains enlightenment but delays nirvana to help others. Similarly, the lone thinker's insights are valueless if they die in the skull of the thinker. The friction between the lone thinker and society is where value is created. The thinker mines the raw material in solitude, but it must be refined in the marketplace of ideas. Writing, speaking, and teaching are the bridges the lone thinker builds back to the world. 2. Structured solitude. The healthy model for the future is not the permanent hermit, but the rhythmic thinker. This aligns with the biological concept of oscillation, sleep and wake, inhale and exhale. Period of withdrawal, deep work, meditation, reading, fasting from social input. The accumulation phase. Period of engagement, discussion, publication, application, social bonding. The distribution phase. Psychologically, this balance prevents the madness of isolation while preserving the depth of solitude. 3. Conclusion. The guardian of the inner world. In conclusion, the lone thinker is not a rejection of humanity, but an embracement of the specific human capacity for metacognition. Philosophy teaches us that solitude is the forge of the self and the sanctuary of truth. Psychology teaches us that it is the engine of creativity and the stabilizer of the psyche. In a world that is increasingly loud, fast, and superficial, the lone thinker represents the depth, the pause, and the slow digestion of reality. To be a lone thinker is to take responsibility for one's own consciousness. It is the difficult, noble task of being the architect of one's own mind, building a structure strong enough to hold the weight of truth without collapsing under the pressure of loneliness. The lone thinker stands on the periphery, watching the crowd, not with disdain, but with the necessary distance to see where the crowd is going, and perhaps to map a better way. A note on the tortured genius archetype. It would be remiss to conclude without addressing the romanticization of the tortured genius. History is littered with lone thinkers who paid a heavy psychological price. Van Gogh, Woolf, Foster Wallace. However, psychology distinguishes between the correlation and causation of solitude and suffering. It is often not the solitude that causes the suffering. Rather, individuals with turbulent minds seek solitude to manage their internal noise. For these individuals, solitude is a form of self-medication. The danger lies when the lone thinker identity becomes a mask for avoiding necessary clinical help or human intimacy. The goal of the philosophical life is flourishing, eudaimonia, not suffering. If solitude leads to a shrinkage of the soul rather than an expansion, it has ceased to be a tool of the thinker and has become a prison of the loner. Final thoughts. The lone thinker remains the ultimate nonconformist. In an age of teamwork, collaboration, and open offices, the insistence on closed doors and silence is a radical act. It is an assertion that the most important relationship a human being will ever have is the one they have with themselves. And it is in that silent relationship that the future of human thought is written.